Welcome to the deep dive. We take stacks of sources, cut through all that noise, and get straight to the insights that really matter for you. Today we're unpacking a technology that landed with some of the, well, boldest, most revolutionary promises maybe ever, a vision to basically change money forever. We are, of course, diving deep into Bitcoin, its initial promises versus, the realities it actually delivered. Our mission in this deep dive, pretty clear. Meticulously compare those original visions with the actual outcomes. We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge. Think of it as a shortcut, really, to getting properly informed on one of the most talked about and, let's be honest, often misunderstood topics of our time.
Exactly. We'll be tracing back to those initial ideals, right, from Bitcoin's introduction in 2008, 2009. A lot of famously laid out in Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, Bitcoin,
Right.
peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And then we'll really see how those aspirations actually held up against the practicalities, the complexities, sometimes the harsh challenges of the real world.
So what did Bitcoin promise back then, and what did it actually end up delivering?
Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this. Maybe let's start by just setting the scene a bit. When Bitcoin first burst onto the scene, wow, it really captivated those early adopters, didn't it? Especially folks from, say, libertarian backgrounds, tech enthusiasts. It came with this set of incredibly bold, revolutionary promises. Our sources point to about 8 core visions that really fueled that initial excitement. We're talking ambitious claims like decentralized money.
No central bank, just peer-to-peer.
Right, and trustless transactions, verified by crypto proof, not middlemen.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Then there was lower transaction fees, supposedly cheaper than banks, especially across borders. Also financial inclusion, making it globally accessible even for the unbanked. Protection from inflation, with its fixed supply, like digital gold.
The 21 million cap, yeah.
Then, transparency and security, this immutable public ledger secure by design. And crucially, censorship resistance. Governments, banks, they couldn't just block your transactions. A key point for many early on.
And finally, developer opportunity. It really did spark a wave of innovation, smart contracts, DeFi, that whole ecosystem. So these were the core ideas, right? The driving forces behind that early excitement. But what's really fascinating, and what our sources dig into, is how many of these actually came true and how many just stayed aspirational or, well, didn't quite work out.
Yeah, and it's important to frame these not necessarily as like deliberate lies, but maybe as idealistic visions that for a whole bunch of reasons just didn't fully materialize as planned. The material we looked at sorts them quite neatly. 3 that mostly failed or were pretty misleading, 3 partial successes maybe, and then 2 that are actually pretty strong wins. What's really interesting here is that some of the core technical promises, they largely held up, but others, they hit some significant real-world friction, some unexpected stuff.
Okay, so let's dive into that then. Where did Bitcoin actually deliver, or at least partly deliver? Let's start there before we get into the areas where reality and the promises really diverged.
Okay, well, trustless transactions, that aspect, it largely held up, actually. Transactions genuinely don't rely on intermediaries. They're verified directly by cryptographic proof, right there on the blockchain.
So that core mechanism worked as described.
Pretty much, yes. And developer innovation.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That was a massive win. Bitcoin undeniably kicked off an entire crypto industry. It fostered smart contracts, DeFi. I mean, that ripple effect is huge and undeniable.
Okay, 2 strong points there. What about transparency and security?
Well, that one's mostly true, at least regarding its cryptographic design and the public nature of the ledger. It is cryptographically secure in that sense, and yes, transactions are on an immutable public ledger. But, and this is a big but, this is where it starts to get interesting.
Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting, you said. Because that transparency, while a feature, it also creates a major conflict, doesn't it? A contradiction with another big promise. Privacy. The early talk, was often Bitcoin is anonymous, but the sources we have suggest that was, well, deeply misleading.
You're absolutely right. Reality showed pretty quickly that Bitcoin is pseudonymous, not anonymous. Huge difference. Every single transaction is permanently etched onto that public ledger. So if anyone, anywhere, manages to link your real-world identity to your wallet address, even just once, boom, your entire financial history tied to that address is out there for them to see.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's exactly why companies like Chainalysis exist. Their whole business model is basically de-anonymizing wallet owners for law enforcement or whoever. Ironically, traditional banking, with its closed records and legal protections, often ends up offering more practical privacy for the average person.
That is ironic.
It is. Privacy just wasn't a core design goal for Bitcoin itself. That's why other coins like Monero or Zcash popped up later, specifically to try and fix that perceived flaw. But that initial myth, Bitcoin is private, It unfortunately led a lot of people to expose themselves without even realizing it.
Okay, so transparency had that downside. If privacy was a myth, what about security itself? The promise was safe and secure. But we hear these horror stories, people losing millions.
Yeah.
How does that square with the promise?
Right. Well, again, it's about definition. Is it secure cryptographically? Largely, yes. The network itself is robust against certain kinds of attacks. But is it safe and secure from a human perspective? From a usability angle? That's where it gets dangerous.
How so?
Well, think about it. Lose your private key, your funds are gone, poof, forever. No recovery mechanism, nothing. Use an exchange. You're vulnerable to hacks, we saw with Mt. Gox, Bitfinex, plenty of others. Software wallets. They can get hit by malware, phishing scams. And crucially, there's no safety net, no customer support line to call, no fraud protection like your credit card offers, zero legal recourse most of the time. It basically shifts all the responsibility, all the risk onto the individual user. And for most people, that's just not what safety means in practice.
It sounds like that promise of freedom from banks also meant freedom from any kind of safety net.
Exactly. It delivered total personal responsibility, which is a much, much heavier burden than I think many people anticipated. Be careful what you wish for, right?
Right. Okay, building on that idea of decentralization, there was that foundational claim, wasn't there? That every user would hold a full copy of the blockchain ledger. But even back then, the sheer amount of data, millions of transactions, it seemed technically impossible for just average folks to keep that updated in real time. Was that just an ideal, or was it, like our sources hint, maybe a bit misleading from the start?
Our sources definitely lean towards misleading on that specific point, especially when taken literally. Maybe an oversimplification that bordered on a lie by omission, you could say. The reality, the Bitcoin blockchain is massive, over 550 gigabytes, and it just keeps growing.
Wow, most people can't store that easily.
Exactly. Most users never run a full node. They rely on lightweight wallets or, more often, centralized exchanges to interact with the network.
Yeah.
Keeping that massive ledger synced in real time across millions of individual devices globally. It's just not technically or logistically feasible. What that means is that power inevitably concentrates. It rests with those who can afford the hardware and bandwidth to run full nodes, and with the large mining operations. So that idea of everyone holding the ledger, it served ideological goals, marketing goals maybe, much more than it reflected technical truth. That specific vision was pretty much a myth from day one.
Okay, that concentration of power you mentioned, miners, node operators, that makes me think about another promise. The idea that Bitcoin would be completely democratic, no single entity, no government in control. But then we see things like Sorks, right? Where small groups essentially create a new version with different rules. So who really does control Bitcoin then?
Yeah, this really hits the core myth of blockchain governance, doesn't it? The reality is quite different from that democratic ideal. In practice, Bitcoin core developers, a relatively small group, hold enormous influence over protocol decisions and software updates.
Okay.
Mining, highly concentrated. A handful of massive mining pools control a huge chunk of the network's hashing power, which gives them significant sway. And those forks you mentioned, like Bitcoin Cash, they happened precisely because powerful groups wanted to change the rules. And they had enough influence, technical, financial, to actually pull it off.
And the exchanges play a role too.
A crucial one. Exchanges effectively decide which version of a fork chain survives by choosing which one they'll list and support for trading. The average user, they have almost zero say in any of this. So, calling it democratic is a stretch. It's maybe closer to a technocracy ruled by the devs, combined with a plutocracy ruled by the whales, the big holders and miners. Consensus emerges more from these power dynamics than any kind of broad voting. That promise clearly didn't match the real-world implementation.
And that leads us to maybe the most challenging myth, perhaps even dangerous, the idea that Bitcoin would always be beyond government control, forever out of their reach.
Yeah, this is a really key area where the initial promise just fundamentally diverged from how things played out. Governments absolutely can and do exert control. They regulate or even ban the exchanges, those critical on-ramps and off-ramps between crypto and regular money.
Right, the choke points.
Exactly. They impose KYCML rules. Know your customer. Anti-money laundering, forcing exchanges to identify users. They use sophisticated blockchain forensic tools to track funds. They can arrest developers like we saw with Tornado Cash. They can ban mining entirely like China did. They can sanction specific wallet addresses, blacklist them.
So they don't need to switch off the whole internet or anything.
No, not at all. While the core Bitcoin protocol itself might be decentralized and hard to shut down directly, everything around it, the exchanges, the wallets, converting it back to dollars or euros, even developer access, all of that is very much subject to state control. Governments don't need to shut down Bitcoin globally. They can just make it practically unusable or incredibly risky for the average person within their jurisdiction. That promise of being beyond government control, highly idealistic, and ultimately quite misleading. And while we're talking about promises that didn't quite pan out, lower transaction fees. Remember that one?
Yeah, cheaper than banks, especially for international transfers.
That one has largely failed, at least for Bitcoin itself being used as a widespread payment system. Fees can often be surprisingly high now, especially when the network is busy. It completely contradicts that initial vision.
Okay. What about financial inclusion, bringing banking to the unbanked globally?
That one, too, has mostly fallen short. It's just proven really difficult for low-income individuals or those truly outside the banking system to adopt and use Bitcoin effectively as a day-to-day financial tool. The barriers, technical, cost, volatility are just too high for many. So that vision of widespread accessibility, not really realized.
And the last one we touched on earlier, protection from inflation, the digital gold idea.
Right. Conceptually, the fixed supply of 21 million coins is true. That part holds. The intent was to make it an inflation hedge, like digital gold. However, and it's a huge however, that promise has been seriously undermined by its extreme price volatility.
The wild swings.
Exactly. Those wild price swings make it almost impossible to rely on as a stable hedge against inflation for most people or institutions. It behaves much more like a highly speculative asset than a reliable store of value against economic uncertainty. That's a critical difference from the original promise.
Okay, that covers the promises versus reality pretty thoroughly. Now, we need to address probably the most provocative point raised in our source material, maybe the most controversial, the accusation that Bitcoin and its operation functions like, well, like the biggest Ponzi scheme ever.
Yes, that's definitely a strong claim, and you're right, it's controversial. But it's not just coming out of nowhere. Many respected economists, regulators, they share this concern, or at least elements of it. Our sources highlight several core features that Bitcoin seems to share with how a Ponzi scheme operates. First, and maybe most critically, early adopters only profit if new money comes into the system from later buyers.
Because there's no underlying value generation.
Precisely. There's no inherent cash flow, no dividends, no real intrinsic value being created that justifies the price. Its worth depends entirely on price appreciation, which itself is driven solely by new people buying in, hoping the price will go up further. The material we reviewed also emphasizes the role of whales, those very large holders. They have the power to potentially manipulate the market through coordinated actions, these TUMPs, to artificially inflate the price.
To attract new buyers.
To attract new buyers, often retail investors who are lured in by the hype, by stories of getting rich quick. And the concern raised is that these newer, smaller investors often end up acting as the exit liquidity.
Meaning their money allows the earlier, bigger players to cash out their profits.
That's the argument, yes. And that new hype narratives, new stories, seem to be crafted basically every market cycle to attract the next wave of buyers, often called the greater fools in this context. And critically, unlike regulated markets like stocks, the crypto space largely lacks the same rules. There are generally no mandatory disclosures, no robust rules against insider trading, often very little accountability for market manipulation. Behavior that would be outright criminal in traditional finance can be pretty routine in crypto.
So it's not identical to a classic Madoff-style Ponzi.
No, not identical in structure. But the critique, as presented in our sources, is that it functions in a similar way, a system that tends to enrich the insiders and early adopters primarily at the expense of the latecomers who buy in at inflated prices. That's the difficult truth that some analyses suggest lies beneath the revolutionary technology branding.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this actually mean for you, the listener? We've taken this deep dive into Bitcoin's founding promises, right? And we've meticulously compared them with how things actually played out in the real world. We've uncovered where those grand ideals kind of collided with, well, practical challenges, power dynamics, market forces.
Yeah, we've really seen a fascinating spectrum, haven't we? From genuine, undeniable innovation like the developer opportunity it unleashed, all the way to fundamental challenges and maybe even failures in areas like practical privacy, user security, and that ideal of decentralized governance. Plus, there's that ongoing, really intense debate about its market dynamics and whether it resembles a speculative bubble or something more problematic. Hopefully this knowledge helps you see beyond the simple hype, understand the real complexities here.
Absolutely. Our goal really was just to help you quickly get your head around the nuances of what is an incredibly complex subject. We've tried to extract the key insights from all the material we looked at.
And for you, the learner, the key takeaway isn't just, a list of facts about Bitcoin. It's maybe more about developing a framework for thinking critically about any emerging technology, especially those that arrive wrapped in really revolutionary promises.
Right. And maybe a final thought for you to mull over, something to consider as you go. If a technology's initial promises end up serving perhaps more ideological and marketing purposes than reflecting cold, hard, technical truth, How should we, as users, as observers, as potential participants, how should we assess its true value and its real potential moving forward?